In this video, we're going to be making another modulated bass sound that's inspired by neurofunk basses and also some of the bass sounds of Noisia. It's going to be a little bit more of an aggressive sounding bass line, and it's going to sound like this. So I went ahead and loaded everything up like I did in some of the previous videos, so I have an initialized version of Massive X, and we'll be using this to create our bass line. So first, go up to the oscillator section on the first wavetable and bring that down to -24, so that we have a really low bass note that we'll be working with. And we're actually going to keep this on the default wavetable, but we want to push this over so it's more of a square waveform, but has a little bit of this kind of ramp at the end, which gives us sort of a hybrid between a square waveform and a saw waveform, which will give us just a little bit more overtones to everything. We want to make sure that the volume of that is all the way up, and then we're going to add some frequency modulation to that as well. So enable PM number 1 to the triangle B3 waveform. Move this down 1 octave, which will be 1/2.000. And again, these are the same as the ratios on FM8 if you're familiar with that synthesizer. So all this is doing is bringing this oscillator down 1 octave. So for now, we can actually just increase this to about 75% or 65% or so. We'll be actually modulating this a little bit later, but that way you could just hear the sound, which sounds like this. So right now this bass patch doesn't sound like much, but we'll be adding in a lot of different modulations to this to make it a bit more interesting. So the next thing that I want to do is just turn down the volume so we don't have any clipping problems a little bit later. And then we can move down to our amplifier envelope. So make sure that that is enabled. And then go over to the attack, make sure that's at 0, leave the decay and sustain where they're at, and bump that release just slightly. The main modulation and character of this bass line will be created by modulating a bandpass filter. So go over to the filters, change that over to the Blue Monarch filter, and change that over to the bandpass mode. Leave the resonance where it's at, and then bring the frequency down to just a little bit over 25% or so, or actually bring it down to about there, so about 25%. And then we'll overdrive this, so it's basically just pointing out where the G is in gain. So this filter type just lets a narrow band of frequencies pass through. And that band of frequencies can be selected by adjusting the filter's cutoff. And then we want to go ahead and create some modulation for our bass line. So go down to performance envelope number 1, change that to the keyboard launch mode so that every time we press our key, the envelope will restart. And then we can go ahead and enter in the various modulation points. So have that set to the 8th note quantize here, and then create 2 different points. So we'll have this modulation go up and then down. And then we can also have this go for 1 bar, so it loops once it finishes playing back. And then we want to have this go for another point here, so we'll increase that. And then we want to have it go down in a ramp formation. So we'll have it be at 100%. And then the waveform will move down like a downward saw waveform. And then we'll have that move up slowly. And then back down. Then we can even make a few adjustments here. So on this point on the bottom, let's just pull that over so that this end modulation is a little bit slower and the ramp modulation is a little bit faster. And then we want to go in and adjust these curves to make everything a little bit tighter. So just click on those and drag them down. And later we can make some adjustments to tighten up this filter's modulation curve. This will kind of just give us a good starting point for our sound. So next, let's add in a little bit of a noise as well. So the first thing that we'll modulate is going to be a little bit of this white noise. So we'll just increase that slightly. And I actually want to go over into the routing menu and take this white noise and route that into our effects section, which will be effects Y, which we're going to add a dimension expander in there a bit later. So we can go back to this menu. So basically it's just increasing the volume of the white noise as this envelope is looping back. And then we can add this modulation to the various other parameters on the synthesizer. So click on this and we'll have that modulate the waveform to move up and down. And then we'll also have that modulate this frequency modulation as well. So we'll turn that down to 0, and then we'll modulate that upwards to just about there or so. And then so far that sounds like this. So you can hear the waveform modulation and also the FM modulation and the noise. And now we want to add that into our filter as well. So click on this and go over to the filter and move that up to just about there. We can even bring the filter cutoff frequency down and then increase the modulation as well. So far that sounds like this. So it gives us a nice and aggressive tone that we can work with. So let's go over to this first effect slot and add in the nonlinear lab, which has some really great distortion effects that are inside of it. So we'll go over to the soft clip mode, bring that up to just about there, bring the mix all the way up so the entire sound is distorted. And then we can leave these values where they are by default. And that sounds like this. So a lot more aggressive, and that's just created by the soft clipping distortion. And then we can add in a dimension expander. So click on that and add in the dimension expander and bring the value down just a little bit and the stereo width all the way up. So this will give our whole bass line a nice sense of space. Then the final thing that I want to do on the effects section is add in a really short room reverb. This is something that sounds really interesting on especially these really heavily distorted and modulated bass lines, because it can really widen up your sound and make it sound like it's taking place in this sort of environment rather than just having a really dry sounding bass. So it creates sounds that are a bit more interesting. So go ahead and go over to the reverb, keep the send amount all the way up, bring the mix down to just about there, bring the size down so we have a really short sounding reverb, and then also bring the color down so that the whole sound is a bit darker, and then push the chorus up as well. And that sounds like this. Then the next thing that we want to do is go over to our voicings tab, and we're going to change the engine setup to reset all, so that way the phase of the oscillators always start off on the same phase. By default, it's set to the free run mode, which is an analog style behavior that allows the oscillators to just kind of individually cycle. But because we're making this really tight sounding bass line, we want all of the waveforms to start off at exactly the same position every single time, so we have much more of a subby sound. So that sounds like this. And especially listening to the beginning transient at the very start of the bass, there's a lot more of a sub impact happening whenever you have it set to reset all, because all of those waveforms phases are all starting off at the same point. So then we can go in and just make a few different adjustments. So we can go over to the white noise and bring that down slightly so it's not too loud. We can take the filter's cutoff down slightly so it's a little bit more of a dark sound. And then we can maybe even bump up the FM just a little bit. So that helps make the bass line just a little bit more aggressive. So that's the bass line sorted. Now we can move over to the notes that I had in the introduction as the demo and show you what I had going on. So it's just a really simple note pattern here. It is just an F note in the second octave playing back for 4 bars, which sounds like this. So that's the completed patch sorted. If you'd like to make any sort of adjustments to the modulation on the bass line, there's a few parameters that you want to pay attention to that enable you to sort of evolve the sound. The first of which is the performance envelope number 1, which will enable you to either make a tighter modulation curve or one that's more open. So we could tighten up the modulation entries that we have here. And that would sound something like this. So it has this tonality to it that almost has more of this whiplash type sound. And the other parameter that enables you to adjust things is the distortion amount. So you could reduce the amount of drive to get a sound that's a bit softer and more dark. Or you can increase that amount to get something more distorted. So it just depends on what type of sound you're going for. And the final parameter that you can adjust is the bandpass filter's cutoff frequency point. You could start that off at a higher point to get more of a high frequency sound. Or if you want something a bit darker and a bit more low end, you can bring that frequency cutoff down. And I'll just put that back to what it was by default. So that's this bass patch sorted. I hope you enjoyed the sound design video, and I will see you in the next one.